The rain had just started, a light drizzle that turned the world silver under the streetlights. I stood in the doorway of our house, our home, or what used to feel like one, and watched Elena's car pull into the driveway. The glow of her headlights cut through the mist, and for a second, I let myself believe that everything was fine. That she was just late from work, caught up in some meeting or traffic jam, and she'd come through the door with her usual smile, complaining about her day and kicking off her heels. But when she stepped out of the car, her movements were too purposeful. The kind of purposeful that made my stomach churn. Her hair was loose, framing her face like she'd just touched it up, and her jacket clung to her like it wasn't meant for the office but for someone's approving eyes. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway as she opened the front door, brushing past me without looking up. "Late again," I said, my voice even but firm. She froze for just a second, her hand tightening on her purse strap. "Yeah. Big client meeting ran over. You know how it is." I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. "Do I?" She glanced up then, her eyes sharp but wary, like a boxer assessing an opponent. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. Instead, I studied her, really studied her. The faint smudge of lipstick at the corner of her mouth. The way her blouse was tucked in just a little too neatly. The smell of perfume mixed with something else, something I couldn't name but knew didn't belong to me. "You hungry?" I asked instead, keeping my tone neutral. She blinked, caught off guard by the shift. "I ate already." "Where?" "With the team." Her reply was too quick, her voice too practiced. I nodded slowly, pushing off the wall. "All right then." Elena turned and started toward the stairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood. "I'm going to shower." "Long day." "Yeah," I said to her back. "Long day." The silence she left behind was heavy, the kind that settled in your chest and refused to let you breathe. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a drink, the ice cubes clinking against the glass. It wasn't even late, but the house felt darker than it should have. Maddie and Chloe were upstairs in their rooms, likely glued to their screens or lost in their own teenage worlds. They didn't need to see this. Not yet. I stood at the window, staring out into the night as the rain picked up. The glass of bourbon in my hand barely made a dent in the knot forming in my stomach. This wasn't the first late night for Elena. It wasn't even the fifth. And every time she walked through that door with a ready excuse and that distracted smile, the knot tightened. My phone buzzed on the counter, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Maddie. "Is Mom okay? She seems different lately." I stared at the words for a long moment before typing back, "She's fine. Just busy." It was a lie, of course. But what the hell else could I say? Your mom's lying. Your mom's hiding something and I don't know what it is yet, but it's there like a ghost in the corner of every room she walks into. I finished my drink in one gulp, the burn trailing all the way down. When I heard the shower upstairs shut off, I poured another. The truth was, I wasn't fine either. And I hadn't been for a while. When Elena came back down, her hair damp and her face scrubbed clean of makeup, she looked like the woman I'd married. The one who used to curl up on the couch with me and binge bad movies, who used to laugh so hard she snorted, who used to wear my sweatshirts even though they swallowed her whole. But now there was something distant in her eyes, something I couldn't reach no matter how hard I tried. "I'm heading to bed," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of finality. I nodded, watching as she disappeared up the stairs. The sound of her footsteps faded, leaving me alone in the silence again. For the first time, I let the thought sink in, cold and unrelenting. Maybe she wasn't coming home late for work. Maybe she was coming home late for someone else. The idea sat like a brick in my gut. I hated myself for thinking it, hated her for making me think it. But most of all, I hated the possibility that it could be true. I finished my drink and set the empty glass on the counter, the sound echoing in the stillness. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened window, tired, worn, and just angry enough to start asking questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving the morning air heavy and damp. I woke early, my head still buzzing from the bourbon and my chest tight with unresolved tension. The bed beside me was empty. The covers pulled neatly back as though Elena hadn't slept there at all. I found her in the kitchen, already dressed, sipping coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The light from the window caught the gold band on her finger, a quiet reminder of everything we'd built together. Everything that now felt like it was slipping through my fingers. "Morning," I said, leaning against the doorway. She looked up, her expression neutral. "Morning." I grabbed a mug and poured myself a cup, letting the silence stretch. The girls would be up soon, and once they were, any chance of a real conversation would vanish. Not that I was sure what I wanted to say. "You heading in early again?" I asked casually, keeping my tone light. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Yeah. Another meeting." I nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "Busy week." "It is." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Instead, I watched her as she busied herself with her bag, slipping her phone inside and grabbing her keys. "Elena," I said suddenly, my voice stopping her mid-motion. She looked up, her expression carefully blank. "Are we okay?" Her lips parted as if she was about to answer, but then she closed them again. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture I knew meant she was stalling. "Of course we are," she said finally. "Why would you even ask that?" I shrugged, setting my mug down. "Just feels like you've been somewhere else lately." Her shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, guilt, maybe, or defensiveness. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "Work's just been crazy," she said, her tone dismissive. "You know how it is." "Do I?" I asked, echoing the words I'd said the night before. Her jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Maddie wandered into the kitchen, her hair a mess and her eyes half closed. "Morning," she mumbled, grabbing a bowl from the cabinet. Elena seized the interruption like a lifeline. "I'll be home late again. Don't wait up." She kissed Maddie on the forehead, avoided my gaze, and hurried out the door before I could say another word. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway lingered in the air long after she was gone. I stared at the empty doorway, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "You okay, Dad?" Maddie's voice snapped me back to the present. She was looking at me, her sharp eyes too perceptive for a 15-year-old. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press either. I watched her pour cereal into her bowl, her movements so routine it was almost comforting. But my mind was miles away, following Elena to wherever it was she was really going. By lunchtime, the suspicion had twisted into something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the late nights or the guarded phone anymore. It was the feeling of being shut out, of being a stranger in my own marriage. And the worst part? I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or finally seeing the cracks that had been there all along. I left work early, telling my boss I had a family emergency. It wasn't a lie, not really. Something was wrong in my family, even if I didn't have the details yet. Elena's office wasn't far from the hardware store, a sleek glass building that stood in stark contrast to the worn-down streets surrounding it. I parked across the street and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. It felt ridiculous, sitting there like some private investigator in a bad movie, but I needed to see it for myself. I needed proof. An hour passed. Then another. I was starting to feel like an idiot when I saw her. She walked out of the building, her hair falling perfectly around her shoulders, her posture straight and confident. But she wasn't alone. A man followed close behind, his hand brushing the small of her back as they stepped onto the sidewalk. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly tailored suit that screamed money. They didn't look at each other, didn't say a word, but there was something in the way they moved, in the way she glanced over her shoulder at him as they reached the corner, that made my stomach turn. I clenched the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. The way she leaned toward him, her lips curved into a faint smile, that told me everything I needed to know. When they disappeared around the corner, I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty street. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The truth was right there, staring me in the face, and yet I couldn't bring myself to fully accept it. Not yet. I started the car and drove home, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down on me like a physical thing. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were trembling. Elena's betrayal was real. I didn't have all the details, but I had enough. And now, I needed a plan. I sat in the truck long after I pulled into the driveway, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. The house was just as I'd left it, the curtains drawn, the lights still off. For a moment, I let myself imagine walking in there, making dinner for the girls, pretending everything was normal. Pretending I hadn't seen what I'd seen. But the image shattered the moment I stepped inside. Maddie and Chloe were arguing in the living room over something trivial, whose turn it was to take out the trash, maybe. It was a petty, everyday thing, the kind of sibling spat that usually made me smile. Today, it just made me feel hollow. "Hey girls," I said, shrugging off my jacket and hanging it by the door. My voice sounded strange even to me, like it didn't belong in my own mouth. Chloe looked up from the couch, her big brown eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said quickly, too quickly. "Just a long day." She didn't look convinced, but Maddie interrupted before she could ask more questions. "Can we order pizza? There's nothing in the fridge." "Sure." I pulled out my phone, grateful for the distraction. "Same as usual?" Maddie nodded and went back to her phone, and Chloe settled deeper into the couch. For a moment, the noise of their bickering gave way to the soft murmur of the TV. But the quiet didn't last long. My mind wouldn't let it. By the time the pizza arrived, my stomach was in knots. I barely touched a slice before setting my plate down and excusing myself. Upstairs, the master bedroom felt colder than usual, the air heavy with the faint smell of Elena's perfume. I stood in the doorway, staring at the neatly made bed, the bedside lamp she always left on for me, the photo of us on our wedding day that sat on her nightstand. 15 years. That's how long we'd been together. Long enough to know each other's habits, quirks, the way she always left her coffee cup half full, the way she laughed with her whole body when something really caught her off guard. And yet here we were. 15 years reduced to whispers and shadows and secrets. I turned away from the bed and walked to her dresser. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened the top drawer, rifling through her neatly folded clothes. It wasn't until I reached the back that I found it, a slim, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of scarves. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. She'd always been a private person, her thoughts carefully guarded. I'd never invaded that space before. But now I needed answers. The journal was pristine, the pages crisp and white. The first few entries were harmless, grocery lists, reminders about work, notes about the girls. But as I flipped further, the handwriting changed. It became messier, more frantic. "I feel like I'm suffocating." The words jumped off the page, sharp and raw. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. I flipped to the next page, then the next, each entry unraveling a thread of the life I thought we'd shared. "He doesn't see me anymore. I miss feeling alive." And then, the one that stopped me cold. "Ryan understands me in ways Ben never could." The name hit me like a fist. Ryan. The man from earlier. The man who'd walked so close to her, who'd touched her back like he had every right to. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The air around me felt too thick, too heavy to breathe. For a moment, I considered throwing the damn thing across the room, shattering the illusion completely. But instead, I slipped it back into the drawer and closed it carefully, as if touching it any longer might burn me. She came home late that night. The girls were asleep, the house dark except for the faint glow of the living room lamp. I was sitting on the couch, waiting, the tension in my chest coiled tight enough to snap. The front door creaked open, and she stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the floor. When she saw me, she froze, her hand still on the doorknob. "Ben," she said, her voice careful, too careful. "What are you doing up?" "Waiting for you." Her eyes flicked to the clock, then back to me. "It's late. You should be in bed." "Yeah," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. But I couldn't sleep. Kept wondering where you were. She didn't answer. Instead, she set her bag down slowly, deliberately, like she was afraid of making too much noise. "How's Ryan?" I asked, the words coming out sharper than I intended. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "What?" "You heard me." She stared at me, her face a mixture of shock and something else, something closer to fear. "I don't know what you're talking about." Don't lie to me, Elena. I stood, my voice rising. I saw you. Today. Leaving the office with him. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her chest rising and falling quickly. It's not what you think, she said finally, her voice trembling. No. I stepped closer, my anger boiling over. Then what is it, Elena? Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn clear. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it again. But then she exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging. It's complicated. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. Complicated? Of course it is. She looked at me then, her eyes glistening. I didn't mean for it to happen. But it did, I said, my voice cold. And now you're going to tell me exactly how and why and for how long. She hesitated, her lips trembling. Ben, please? Don't. I pointed a finger at her, my voice shaking. You don't get to beg me for anything right now. You owe me the truth. All of it? Her silence spoke louder than any excuse ever could. She sank into the armchair across from me, her head in her hands, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I thought about the journal, about her whispers of suffocation and her secrets with Ryan, and the anger surged back, sharp and unrelenting. How long? I asked, my voice hard, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Elena didn't look up. It wasn't supposed to, it wasn't meant to happen. That's not an answer. She winced, her hands tightening into fists. A few months, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Since April. April? I repeated, the word burning on my tongue. That's almost 6 months, Elena. I know. Do you? I barked, standing up and pacing the room. Do you have any idea what it's been like? Watching you come home late, lying to my face, making me feel like I'm crazy for noticing something's wrong. She flinched again, her shoulders hunching like she was trying to make herself smaller. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? I demanded, spinning to face her. Make me understand, Elena. Tell me why you decided that screwing Ryan was worth blowing up 15 years of marriage. Her face crumpled at that, tears spilling down her cheeks. It wasn't about him. Bullshit. It wasn't, she insisted, her voice breaking. It was about me. I was drowning, Ben. Every day felt like the same damn thing. Work, kids, laundry, sleep, repeat. I couldn't breathe. I needed something, someone, to remind me that I was alive. And you couldn't tell me that? I snapped. You couldn't come to me, the man who's been in your corner since we were 22, and say, hey, I'm struggling? No, you had to take it to him. But because he's new? Because he's shiny and exciting and makes you feel special? She looked up at me then, her face streaked with tears, her eyes pleading. You don't understand. No, I said coldly, I don't. And I don't think I ever will. The room fell silent, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on us like a physical thing. I stood there, staring at her, searching for the woman I thought I knew, but all I saw was a stranger who'd torn our life apart. Is it over? I asked finally, my voice low and sharp. What? With him, I said, my jaw tightening. Is it over? She hesitated, and that was all the answer I needed. Jesus Christ, Elena, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. You're still seeing him? It's not like that, she said quickly, her voice desperate. I ended it. I did. But, it's complicated. There's that word again, I said bitterly. What does that even mean? Are you still talking to him? Still sneaking around? She looked away, her silence damning. I laughed then, a harsh, humorless sound. Unbelievable. Ben, please, she said, standing and reaching for me. I'm sorry. I am. I never meant to hurt you. I stepped back out of her reach. But you did. The tears came harder now, her breath hitching as she tried to hold herself together. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe you can't, I said flatly, the words heavy in the air. Her face crumpled again, and for a moment, I hated myself for the pain I was causing her. But then I remembered what I'd seen, what I'd read, what she'd done, and the hate turned inward. I need space, I said finally, my voice strained. I can't. I can't be in the same room as you right now. Ben. No, I cut her off, holding up a hand. Go to bed, Elena. We'll talk later. She stood there for a long moment, her lips trembling, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Then she turned and walked upstairs, her footsteps heavy on the stairs. When I heard the bedroom door close, I sank back onto the couch, my head in my hands. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat there in the dark, staring at the faint glow of the streetlights outside. My mind was a storm of emotions: anger, betrayal, heartbreak, confusion. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, Elena and Ryan, laughing, touching, sharing something I couldn't reach. By the time the sun came up, I had a pounding headache and no clearer idea of what to do next. The girls were still asleep, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker, wondering how I was supposed to function. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was barely 7. Who the hell? When I opened the door, I froze. Ryan stood on the porch, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm. Too calm. We need to talk, he said. I stared at him, my hands tightening on the edge of the door. Of all the scenarios I'd imagined, Ryan showing up on my doorstep wasn't one of them. The audacity of it stunned me into silence for a moment. Ben, right? He said, his voice smooth, practiced, like a man used to defusing tension. Can I come in? I laughed, short, bitter, and sharp enough to cut glass. You've got a hell of a nerve showing up here. I just want to talk, he said, holding his hands up in mock surrender. To clear the air. Clear the air. My voice rose, disbelief and fury crashing together in my chest. You screw my wife, and you think you can just stroll up here to have a chat? He shifted his weight, his calm exterior cracking just slightly. It's not what you think. Really? I stepped onto the porch, forcing him to take a step back. Because what I think is that you've been sneaking around with Elena for months, lying to her, lying to me, and blowing up my goddamn life. So please enlighten me. What is it if not that? He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't confidence. It was fear. She's not happy, Ben, he said finally, his voice soft but firm. Hasn't been for a long time. I clenched my fists, the urge to swing at him almost overwhelming. And you thought you'd fix that, huh? By seducing her? By sneaking around behind my back? It wasn't like that, he said quickly, his voice rising slightly. She came to me. She needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't me, I finished, my voice cold and hard. Yeah, I got that. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. I could hear the faint sound of the girls moving around upstairs, their voices muffled through the walls. It grounded me, kept me from doing something I'd regret. You're a coward, I said finally, my voice low and even. You could have walked away. You could have told her no. But you didn't, because it was easier to take what wasn't yours. He flinched at that, his jaw tightening. Look, I didn't come here to fight. Good, I snapped, stepping closer. Because you'd lose? His eyes flicked toward the street, as though calculating an escape route. For all his bravado, he wasn't built for this. Not like I was. Not like I had to be. Stay away from her, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. If I see you near her again, if I so much as hear your name, I'll make damn sure you regret it. For a second, I thought he might argue. But then he nodded, his confidence draining out of him like water from a leaky bucket. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, his shoulders hunched against the weight of my anger. I stood there on the porch, watching him drive away, my breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The urge to follow him, to finish this, was almost overwhelming. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Elena was waiting for me when I came back inside. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee. When she looked up, her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. I heard, she said softly. Good. I grabbed a mug from the counter and poured myself some coffee, the anger still burning in my chest. Saves me the trouble of repeating it. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, she looked like she might break. But then she straightened, setting the mug down with a sharp clink. You can't just threaten him, Ben. Watch me. She flinched, her hands tightening into fists. This isn't going to fix anything. No, I said, leaning against the counter and crossing my arms. But it's a start. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything unsaid hung between us, heavy and suffocating. Why did you let him in? She asked finally, her voice trembling. Why didn't you just tell him to leave? Because I needed to look him in the eye, I said. I needed to see the kind of man who thought he could take my life and walk away unscathed. And what did you see? I thought about it for a moment, the memory of Ryan's fear flashing through my mind. A coward? She looked away, her shoulders slumping. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You keep saying that, I said, my voice sharp. Like it makes a difference? It does, she said, her voice rising. It wasn't about you, Ben. It was about me, about everything I felt like I'd lost. Then why didn't you fight for it? I snapped. Why didn't you fight for us? Her silence was deafening. The girls were quiet that night, their usual chatter muted as they picked at their dinner. They didn't ask why their mother's eyes were red or why their father barely touched his food. They didn't have to. They knew something was wrong. They could feel it even if they didn't understand it. After they went to bed, Elena and I sat in the living room, the air between us thick with unspoken words. The television was on, but neither of us was watching. Finally, she broke the silence. I don't know how to fix this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe you can't, I said, echoing my words from the night before. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with tears. Do you want me to leave? The question hit me like a blow, sharp and unexpected. Did I? Could I live with her betrayal, or was this the beginning of the end? I don't know, I said finally, the words heavy on my tongue. But I know things can't stay the way they are. Her tears spilled over, and she nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. I'll stay at my sister's for a while. Give you some space? I nodded, my chest tight. Yeah. Maybe that's for the best. As she packed a bag and slipped out the door, I stood in the doorway, watching her go. The rain had started again, soft and steady, washing over the street like a quiet reminder that some storms didn't pass quickly. I didn't know what came next. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The house felt too quiet after Elena left, as though the silence itself was mourning her absence. The girls noticed right away, of course. Chloe asked me outright where their mom had gone, her voice small and uncertain, and Maddie just gave me that look, the one teenagers have perfected, where they know something's wrong but won't say it outright. She's staying with Aunt Claire for a little while, I told them. She needs some space. Maddie didn't say a word, but her jaw tightened, and her eyes flashed with a mix of anger and something I couldn't quite place. Chloe, on the other hand, pressed further. Why does she need space? Did you guys have a fight? It's not that simple, sweetie, I said, ruffling her hair. Sometimes grown-ups just need time to figure things out. Her frown deepened, but she let it drop. For now. The truth was, I didn't have answers for them. Hell, I didn't even have answers for myself. All I had was the image of Ryan standing on my porch, Elena's tear-streaked face as she packed her bag, and the gnawing ache in my chest that refused to go away. By the third day, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. I wandered through the rooms, finding Elena in every corner. The throw blanket she always curled up with on the couch. The half-empty bottle of her favorite perfume on the dresser. The stack of unopened books on her nightstand, their spines perfectly intact because she never seemed to have time to read anymore. I thought about calling her, about demanding answers, or maybe just hearing her voice, but every time I reached for the phone, my hands stopped short. What was the point? What could she possibly say that would make any of this hurt less? Instead, I called Sarah, my younger sister and the one person I could always count on to tell me the brutal, unvarnished truth. Ben, she said, picking up on the first ring. What's going on? I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. She's gone. Gone, or just taking a break? She's at Claire's, I said, running a hand through my hair. But it feels like more than that. Sarah sighed, the sound heavy with understanding. I knew something was up. The way you've been acting lately, it was like you were carrying a secret you didn't want anyone to see. It's not a secret anymore, I said bitterly. She cheated, Sarah. Months of lies, and I didn't even see it. Jesus, she whispered. I'm sorry, Ben. I really am. Yeah, I said, my voice hollow. Me too. We talked for a while, her voice steady and grounding as she walked me through the chaos in my head. By the time we hung up, I felt a little less like the world was caving in around me. But only a little. I went back to work the next day, hoping the routine would help. It didn't. Every task felt meaningless, every conversation shallow. My coworkers tried to cheer me up, but their jokes fell flat, their smiles hollow. I spent most of the day staring at my computer screen, barely registering the words in front of me. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed with a text from Elena. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Can we talk? My first instinct was to ignore it, to let her sit in the mess she'd made. But then I thought about the girls, about the life we'd built together, and I couldn't do it. Not yet. Back. Her reply came almost immediately. Tonight. After the girls are asleep. I didn't respond, but she knew I'd be there. That night, after Chloe went to bed and Maddie disappeared into her room with her headphones on, I sat in the living room, waiting. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet, each second stretching longer than the last. I didn't know what I wanted from this conversation. A confession, an apology, a miracle, but I knew I needed something. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to find Elena standing there, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she wore a simple sweater and jeans. For a moment, she looked like the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, and it hurt more than I cared to admit. Hey, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the crickets outside. Hey. I stepped aside, letting her in. She hesitated in the doorway, her eyes darting around the house like she was afraid to see what had changed. Finally, she sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded in her lap. Thank you for letting me come, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't do it for you, I said, sitting in the armchair across from her. I did it for the girls. She flinched at that, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I deserve that. You deserve a hell of a lot more. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she took a deep breath, her hands shaking. I ended it with Ryan, she said finally, her voice breaking on his name. It's over. Good for you, I said, my tone flat. What do you want, a medal? Her tears spilled over then, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold herself together. I'm sorry, Ben. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said, my voice rising. Sorry doesn't undo the lies, or the months you spent sneaking around, or the fact that you broke every promise we ever made to each other. I know, she whispered, her voice cracking. I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed everything we had. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to grab onto those words and hold them tight, but the anger and the pain wouldn't let me. You've got a funny way of showing it, I said bitterly. She nodded, her tears falling harder. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe you can't, I said, echoing the words I'd been carrying for days. Her face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands, her sobs muffled but still loud enough to cut through me. I sat there, watching her fall apart, and for the first time, I felt the tiniest crack in my armor. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to understanding. I don't know where we go from here, I said finally, my voice quiet. But I know it's not going to be easy. She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with hope and despair in equal measure. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know if I had anything left to give her. But as I sat there, staring at the woman I'd built a life with, I realized one thing. This wasn't just about her betrayal anymore. It was about whether we could survive it. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. Every word Elena and I exchanged felt heavy, weighed down by the things we couldn't yet say. She stayed at Claire's, but we saw each other every evening after the girls were asleep, sitting across from each other in the living room like awkward strangers. Our conversations were polite, careful. She asked about Maddie and Chloe, about work, about mundane details that felt ridiculous in the shadow of what we were navigating. I answered in clipped sentences, unsure of how much I wanted to give her. It was Maddie who broke the dam. She stormed into the kitchen one evening, slamming her backpack on the counter and glaring at me. "When is Mom coming home?" I froze, caught off guard by the directness of her question. "Maddie, it's complicated." "Everything is always complicated with you too," she snapped, her voice cracking. "Why can't you just tell me the truth for once?" Her words hit me hard, sharper than I expected. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Your mom and I, who were trying to figure things out?" "That's not an answer." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, I saw how much she was carrying. "Do you even want her to come back?" Her question gutted me. I stared at her, unable to find the right words. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Her tears spilled over, and she shook her head. "You should know, Dad. You should know." She grabbed her backpack and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there in the silence. I sank into a chair, my head in my hands, the weight of her question pressing down on me. Did I want Elena to come back? When Elena came over that night, I told her what Maddie had said. Her face crumpled, her hands shaking as she clutched her mug of tea. "She's right," she said softly. "You should know." I looked at her, my chest tight. "I don't know how to forgive this, Elena. I don't know if I can." She nodded, her tears spilling over. "I understand." "No, you don't," I said, my voice rising. "You don't understand what it's like to live with this, to know that every time you were late, every time you lied, you were making a choice. You don't understand what it's like to look at you and wonder if anything we had was ever real." Her sobs came harder, but I didn't stop. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice breaking. "I worked late nights and weekends to build a life for us. I showed up for you, for the girls, for everything. And you threw it all away for him? I didn't mean to." "Stop saying that," I snapped, my voice echoing in the room. "You did. You meant to. Because every time you answered his texts, every time you met him, you made a choice." Her tears were silent now, her face pale and stricken. "You're right," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I still love you, Ben. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that if you'll let me." I stared at her, my anger battling with something softer, something I didn't want to name yet. "I don't know if that's enough." "Neither do I," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I'm willing to try. And I'll understand if you're not." Her honesty hit me harder than her lies ever had. For a moment, we sat there in the quiet, the weight of her words settling between us. The next morning, I called Sarah. She came over, her no-nonsense demeanor a sharp contrast to the chaos in my head. We sat at the dining table, the same table where Elena and I had celebrated birthdays, shared meals, and planned a life that now felt like a lie. "You look like hell," Sarah said, her voice blunt but not unkind. "Thanks." She poured herself a cup of coffee, watching me carefully. "So, what's the plan?" "I don't have one." She sighed, shaking her head. "Ben, you've got to figure out what you want. Do you want her back, or do you want to move on?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm still so angry." "That's normal," she said. "But you can't stay there forever. At some point, you've got to decide if you're willing to rebuild or if it's time to walk away." Her words lingered long after she left, echoing in my mind as I went through the motions of the day. By the time Elena came over that night, I still didn't have answers. But I was ready to start asking the questions that mattered. "Do you regret it?" I asked her, the words heavy in the quiet living room. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Of course I do." "Why?" I pressed, leaning forward. "Why do you regret it? Because you got caught? Because it hurt me? Or because it wasn't worth it?" Her face crumpled and she shook her head. "All of it. I regret all of it. I regret hurting you, betraying you, risking everything we had. I regret losing the person I was when we were happy." Her honesty left me breathless, the rawness of her words cutting through my defenses. For the first time, I saw not just the woman who had betrayed me, but the woman who was broken by her own choices. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," I said, my voice low. "I'll earn it," she said quickly, her voice firm despite her tears. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. I'll earn it, Ben." Her desperation felt real, her resolve unshakable. For the first time since this all began, I felt a flicker of hope, not for what we had been, but for what we might still become. "I don't know if I'm ready," I said honestly. "But I'm willing to try." Her tears fell harder then, but this time, they carried something else, relief. The road ahead wasn't clear, and it wasn't easy. But as we sat there together, the space between us smaller than it had been in weeks, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we had a chance to find our way back to each other. And for the first time, that felt like enough.